The Dragon Age franchise is still to this day one of the best RPG video game series of all time, with a variety of difficult choices, engaging gameplay mechanics, and well written companions that still capture the hearts of gamers around the world. What's up guys, it's your boy Lordology here, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at, discussing, and ranking all 4 games in the Dragon Age franchise, and giving my thoughts on what makes this series, despite its age, stand the test of time against many of the titans in the role-playing genre. Now I would like to preface this by saying that this video will contain spoilers for the franchise, and also I am a fairly new Dragon Age player, with my first several playthroughs of the original trilogy being completed in early 2024, so my perception of the series may be different than a lot of other people, considering that I've only ever played the original trilogy with at the very least using over 100 mods per game. Though with that being said, I have spent an embarrassing amount of time getting to know the lore, events, characters, and reading all of the available novels including The Stolen Throne, The Calling, Asunder, The Masked Empire, and Last Flight, as well as the collection of short stories called the Tevinter Nights. The 5 novels and the collection of short stories are great reads, and definitely worth checking out for hardcore Dragon Age fans, but for casual players, it's not essential to understanding the story. And before I begin, I do have ranking videos for both the God of War and Batman Arkham franchises respectively, which I'll leave links in the description to, that you guys should check out if you're interested. Now with all that being said, let's get into it. Now coming in at last place and my least favourite game in the series is Dragon Age Origins.
What did you just say?
Fuck.
Come on now, do you guys seriously think I would put Origins last? Let's try this again. Coming in at number 4, and my real least favourite game in the series, is Dragon Age The Veilguard. Now I don't imagine this ranking would surprise anyone, given the polarising direction of The Veilguard in contrast to the original trilogy. There is a clear decline in writing, characterisation, and world building in The Veilguard that is really hard to ignore when comparing it to all the games in the franchise. On a superficial level, Veilguard has some of the best graphics in the series, which is not surprising for a much newer title, with a fairly beginner-friendly combat system similar to games like Hogwarts Legacy and God of War 2018 that appeals to a much wider audience, with there being much less of a learning curve with its gameplay mechanics. Unfortunately, this lack of depth means that the combat, while initially fun to engage with, ends up feeling quite shallow, flashy, and not at all grounded and well structured as the original trilogy, with no way to control your party members and an absent tactics system, which is replaced with a menu that heavily reminds me of The Witcher 3's radial wheel. The story also feels quite generic, and much of the interesting aspects of the game, like Solas's story, is pushed to the side to make way for badly written companions and bland villains that never really feel like a threat in game, since they literally make it possible to kill archdemons without having the taint, which is quite law-breaking and nonsensical, since before Veilguard only wardens could kill archdemons and die in the process, but now anyone can without dying, which both Davrin and Solas achieve, and that somehow makes the archdemons more threatening, I guess? The main villains of the game, being Elganon and Gillenane, are very forgettable and generic, both of which appear more like cartoon Disney villains rather than the formidable characters they are in the lore, which is such a shame. And it's clear that BioWare were trying to emulate Mass Effect 2 with this game, with both the intro of the game having the main character seemingly die, with the personal companion quests making up a large chunk of the game, and the final mission being much like the final jump through the Omega 4 relay, with the main difference being that Mass Effect 2 respected the player with meaningful choices, excellent and well-rounded companions, all of which can be killed or gotten rid of in several different ways, and there being actual consequences to your actions, that Veilguard sorely lacks. I will say that the only reason that I would be able to justify playing Veilguard is to see the conclusion to the story of the Dreadwolf, and even though the game has many issues, there's a lot of moments with Solas that tease a game that might have been if in the hands of the old Dragon Age team. Unfortunately, barely any choices get carried over from previous games, with many choices being retconned, like Morrigan drinking from the Well of Sorrows and her son Kieran not existing, and it's clear that an Inquisitor that romanced Solas is the intended canon choice of the game. These design choices take away player choice to soft reboot the series, which goes against much of what this franchise is known for, And BioWare not respecting that their fanbase would want to see a proper sequel to the trilogy they grew up with is a major disappointment. I could go on, but I don't want this video to be entirely about the Valguard, though if you guys are interested, you can check out my in-depth and complete critique and review of the Valguard from the links in the description. Overall, Valguard will probably please casual gamers for the most part, but myself being a major Dragon Age fan, I can't justify putting Valguard at any other spot than last for its many glaring issues and lack of quality control in comparison to the other games. Now moving on, and coming in at my third spot is Dragon Age 2. Now I just need to say, even though Dragon Age 2 is my least favourite of the original trilogy, that by no means makes it a bad game. Funnily enough, I would actually consider Dragon Age 2 to be the most underrated game in the franchise, despite it not being received well after its release. It's only over the past several years or so that I've seen a lot of appreciation for this game, and rightly so, because Dragon Age 2 is easily the most fun Dragon Age, with an excellent blend of Origin's tactics system and a more flashy combat system much like Inquisition. Visually, Dragon Age 2 holds up really well, and with a couple of texture mods, you can really bring the standard of this game to a modern audience. I also think that of all the Dragon Age games, Dragon Age 2 is easily the hardest game to complete in the series, and this is mainly because nightmare difficulty in this game is extremely punishing, which makes party composition, tactics, and builds really important mechanics to engage with, which was one of the most fun aspects of Dragon Age 2, and it's this time that it took to understand the mechanics that made the game very satisfying when taking down difficult enemies, with really fast-paced combat, flashy animations, and a real in-depth tactics system that keeps you on your toes. The story of Dragon Age 2 is actually quite unique, since it's the only game in the series that doesn't have the protagonist dealing with a world-ending threat, which is really refreshing to play, and Hawke is such a great character to roleplay as, especially if you play him sarcastically. I genuinely laughed at many of Hawke's interactions, and not because they were bad, but because sarcastic Hawke is such a savage that I couldn't help but admire how witty the dialogue in this game is, and the companions in game really reflect that tone. And Dragon Age 2 has an excellent companion system, with there being a friendly/rivalry system that changes the specialization that companions get, as well as their dialogue and attitude towards Hawke. And I must say, having Isabella on rivalry status and in a romance with her is super entertaining to see. Much of the narrative of Dragon Age 2 revolves around Hawke, his family, and his gradual rise and fall as the champion of Kirkwall, as well as his relationships with several of his interesting companions like Varric, Fenris, and Anders, and if you so choose, both Hawke's sister and mother will be killed during the story, and it actually has much more emotional weight than I was expecting, which was great to see. And the Arishok being one of the main villains as the audience's introduction to the Qunari race is fantastic, as he is both intelligent and formidable, and gave us an excellent look into the world of the Qun, the Arntam, the Tal Vashoth, and how they treat mages by sewing their mouths shut. The endgame villain being Knight Commander Meredith I thought was not too bad. He wasn't as good as the Arishok, but much of the endgame revolves around Anders betraying you to blow up the Chantry, which is super badass and adds a lot more moral ambiguity to the story. Though what I enjoyed about Dragon Age 2 more than anything else was its persecution of the mages in Kirkwall, with Hawke being able to take sides with the Templars or mages, and the way he navigates those sides being really interesting to see unfold, which makes me quite impressed that BioWare was able to weave together this very underrated narrative in such a short period of time. The Legacy DLC is of course another highlight of the game, which is best played once all other content has been completed, and perfectly finishes Hawke's story, with him discovering that his father was a warden mage who used blood magic to keep Corypheus locked in a prison in the Vinmark Mountains. He is of course one of the original 7 high priests of the old gods that entered into the Golden City, who was also the first of the 7 Darkspawn that let the Blight into the world and used the calling of the Grey Wardens to try to lure Hawke to release him, as only the blood of a Hawke can release him, which Hawke is forced to do because there is no way out, which releases the High Priest of Damat, who is then able to escape by possessing whichever character Hawke sided with during the DLC. The Legacy story is filled with awesome Dragon Age lore that it's always a pleasure getting to experience it. Though I do need to mention a pretty big negative for me about Dragon Age 2, and that's the Mark of the Assassin DLC, which I'll be honest, I absolutely hated. Even though for the most part I quite enjoyed the Qunari in Dragon Age 2, the character of Talus, which is basically just a self-inserted Felicia Day, nearly undid all of that for me, with her being a walking oxymoron in regards to the lore of the Qunari, and her character just seems so odd and out of place in this game that I was glad it was just a DLC. And don't get me started on those awful stealth segments. My god, were those terrible. It's like putting stealth gameplay in Witcher 3. Like, bro, it just doesn't work. Overall, Dragon Age 2 is a solid game, despite its issues, and I have enjoyed several playthroughs of the game, and have found a surprising amount of replay value thanks to being able to carry over saves from Origins, which is a feature sorely lacking from later titles, which makes me appreciate Dragon Age 2 even more. Now coming in at my second spot, and what is currently the highest selling game in this franchise, and the highest selling BioWare game, is Dragon Age Inquisition. Honestly, I was surprised that I ranked this game above Dragon Age 2 because my first experience with Inquisition was straight up terrible. Of all the games in this franchise, Inquisition was the most frustrating game to get through. Not because of its story, which is actually quite excellent. No, it's because of the amount of bugs this game still has even over 10 years later that is both with and without mods. When I first tried to play this game on PC, it took me about 6 to 7 new game saves before I could get past the character creator screen, because every time I tried to load in the game, it would spawn me in Haven, but on the other side of the map, which is apparently quite a well-known bug and not a great start, especially coming off the good experience I had with Dragon Age 2, coupled with constant crashes, black loading screens, and the game constantly kicking me to the main menu because I lost connection to the EA server in a fucking single player game. Seriously, thanks for that, EA. Okay, that's enough complaining for now. The only other downside I would say about Inquisition is the open world collectathon, which when I heard about the devs wanting to make this a Dragon Age Skyrim hybrid, it made much more sense. Other than that though, Inquisition, when it's working of course, is a fantastic game, and honestly the more I played it, the more I fell in love with it. This game is easily the most lore-heavy game of the entire franchise that both respects and expands upon the existing Dragon Age lore in so many interesting new ways that honestly I would have to discuss it in an Inquisition dedicated video because man, the lore in this game is fantastic. The visuals in Inquisition still hold up quite well, and when the game is not bugging out, it actually runs quite well on modern PC hardware and looks really good. Now the combat on the other hand was harder for me to assess because at first I had mixed feelings about it. Firstly, I do like the fact that you can still control party members and their placement on the battlefield. There is a tactics menu that while not as detailed as the first few games, it's still serviceable and does the job well, and the level tree and abilities are much more flashy than the previous entries, but what really got me hooked on Inquisition's combat was the specializations and the ability to customize what perks you could put on your armor pieces. This is actually an RPG mechanic that is unique to Inquisition, as none of the other games in the franchise allow you to craft and customize armor in the same way that you can in Inquisition, since all the other games for the most part only have you finding armor and weapons, unlike Inquisition, which has you using schematics and materials, which I actually much prefer for its ability to allow the player to customize your builds in the game in such a precise way that even if you're using the same class and specialization as someone else, the build could be entirely different, which is so awesome. The only complaint I would have is I wasn't really a huge fan of some of the armor appearances, but the ability to craft weapons and armor for yourself and all of your companions on Nightmare difficulty made an RPG min-maxing build junkie like myself extremely happy. Like for example, on my first playthrough I had all 3 of my armor pieces with the every 3, 4 and 5 hits there's a 10% chance that Hidden Blades will activate perk, with increases to dexterity, cunning, critical chance and critical damage, along with the throwing knives, Hidden Blade ability itself, and the Mark of Death ability will have you proccing Hidden Blades non-stop in a visual spectacle of shred that as a rogue character was so fun to see that made the gameplay ridiculously fun for me, so much so that I'm dedicating an entire segment of this video to talk about it. The story of Dragon Age Inquisition, while a common fantasy trope of having a hero rise up to lead a rebellion to save the world, is quite an overused plot device. It's done extremely well in this case, and bolstered by its excellent companions and writing. And if I'm being honest, the Inquisitor would actually be my favourite protagonist in the Dragon Age franchise. And I know that statement might annoy some fans, but I think the Inquisitor is an awesome character, and of all of the Dragon Age protagonists, the Inquisitor is the one I connected with the most, especially on my first playthrough, with playing the Inquisitor in a way that I personally would handle these situations if I was in them, and the British voice actor for Inquisitor Trevelyan did an awesome job that personally had me gripped from the very beginning of the journey. Much of the narrative revolves around the formation of the Inquisition to stop Corypheus from destroying the world and sealing the breach in the Fade, with the Inquisitor having the ability to do so thanks to the Anchor, which is the driving force of the narrative, and honestly, there wasn't a single story thread that I didn't enjoy in this game. All of the companion quests are really well done, with Dorian, Solus, Cassandra and Varric being my personal favourites. Choosing between the Mages and Templars gives different outcomes and is an interesting choice depending on the chosen race and class. The destruction of Haven is tragic, Solus leading the survivors to Skyhold is epic, and hints at him having ulterior motives. The siege of Adamant Fortress, which can lead to the deaths of either Loghain, Strauss, Hawke, or Alistair, depending on choices made in previous games, and you can decide the fate of the Grey Wardens after they turn to using blood magic. Dealing with the succession crisis in All A, which has several outcomes due to your choices, and even has Morrigan appear in the story with unique dialogue based on the choices you made in Origins. The entire plot of the Well of Sorrows with the reveal of Morrigan's mother being Mythal, and if the Inquisitor drank from the well, it allows Mythal to control you, along with Morrigan's son Kieran, allows for the game to have so many different story variations that it's actually crazy. And even Corypheus himself, he definitely wasn't the best villain in the franchise, but he definitely wasn't as bad as everyone says he was, and I was quite satisfied with the ending of the game, with Inquisition directly affecting the Chantry leadership and much of the politics in Thedas. Even the DLCs didn't disappoint, with the Descent further expanding upon the lore of the Dwarves and the Origins with the Titans, and getting to return to the Deep Roads, which was really well designed and expanded upon from Origins. The Jaws of Hakon had you investigating the origins of the first Inquisitor, which was surprisingly something I actually quite enjoyed, and getting to speak to him was a real highlight. And of course, what I consider to be one of the best DLCs of all time, the Trespasser DLC, which takes place a few years after the events of the main game, with the Inquisition growing in power and starting to become corrupt from within, with the Qunari wanting to invade Thedas, which they had been hinting at since Origins with Sten, and of course the final reveal of Solus as the Dreadwolf, the elven god of lies and rebellion. When I first played this, I shit you not, I bawled my eyes out, which does not happen often when I play my games. Everything from the tragic story of the Evanuras killing Mythal, Solus then killing her at the end of Inquisition to regain his power, and setting himself the task of bringing down the Veil to return immortality to the elves, as it was his decisions that led to the centuries of oppression and death for his people that he only wanted to protect in the first place, and him describing the people of this world in his view as tranquil because of the lack of connection to the Fade honestly sent chills down my spine. The music, the stakes, the dialogue, the writing, the acting, all of it just hits like a punch in the gut that I honestly felt so depressed after finishing Inquisition that I was blown away by what BioWare had accomplished. Is Inquisition a perfect game? Very far from it. It has so many open world design choices that I just didn't enjoy, like the Hinterlands being an example of being way too bloated, and the war table being really out of place in a game like this. Though with that being said, there is a few war table mods that do make it fun to engage with, so this wasn't as big of an issue for me as it was for others on release. Overall, Inquisition is by no means a perfect game, and as I said at the start of my ranking of Inquisition, I started off hating this game due to the amount of bugs I encountered, which makes me appreciate the fact that even though I had a mixed experience, I still do consider it to be one of the best games I've ever played, but there is still one game that takes it even further, that to this day is considered a masterpiece by many. With that being said, and coming in at my number one spot is the legendary Dragon Age Origins. I don't know what more I can say about this game that hasn't already been said, but I'll do my best. I had high hopes when I first played Origins, because when someone tells you that this is the best game they've ever played, there's no way it can actually live up to that, right? That's only ever happened to me once with The Witcher 3, and I haven't looked back since. And Origins somehow exceeded my expectations in a way that I didn't think was still possible. The dark fantasy atmosphere, the amazing score, the morally grey and complex world, the ridiculous amount of player choice, the engaging companions with their own opinions, wants, needs, desires, and the political intrigue in the lands of Ferelden being highly cutthroat, with lots of rich history, tragic backstories in a dark world that questions the notion of what it means to be a real hero, and a good person in a morally complex world that rejects those who do things for good reasons but end up becoming the villains themselves. Dragon Age Origins is arguably one of the most mature games I've ever played. This game, above all the games in the franchise, gives the most player choice and prioritizes player agency above all else. The amount of variation in the game is insane, and one playthrough can be completely different from another, with 6 unique origins to choose from that change aspects of the story depending on whether you choose to play as a man or woman, with the female city elf origin being particularly brutal. I've said this in other videos on the channel, but combat in action-adventure games is the combat that I prefer, but when playing Origins, I got completely sucked into its gameplay. The super in-depth tactics system allowed you to set up your party members and the way they fight in so many specific ways that it can be quite overwhelming for new players. Controlling party members to take tactical advantage on the battlefield, like using your warrior to draw aggro while your party flanks your attackers, or leading enemies down a narrow path because a narrow path negates superior numbers. I have never played a game where I actually had to think about and approach gameplay in such a way that I wasn't used to, which is super refreshing with this old school RPG style of combat. And once I got the hang of all of the mechanics, tactics, classes and builds, I knew I was hooked in for a wild ride. Even the individual classes have multiple finishing animations, which the new games in the franchise don't even have, which is wild to think about. The main protagonist of Origins is the Warden, who, depending on your chosen background, changes the circumstances of how you become a Grey Warden, is forced to undergo the joining as a way to fight against the emergence of the Archdemon Othermiel, and the coming of the Fifth Blight, with the Grey Wardens being an ancient sect of warriors who must ingest the blood of the Darkspawn in order to sense and fight back against their enemy, as well as being the only beings in Thedas that can kill an Archdemon permanently. The life of a Grey Warden is difficult, as when their time comes, the calling will begin, where they will hear the voices of the Darkspawn, which is a sign of the taint being close to killing them. So most Grey Wardens, when the calling begins, make their way to the deep roads to die with honour while fighting Darkspawn. The life of a Grey Warden is hard and brutal, and the way you're able to shape your Warden through dialogue choices and how he or she treats people is fantastic, and the role-playing aspect of the dialogue options is beyond well done. Much of the narrative of Origins revolves around the Grey Warden joining the Order because of the Warden's dwindling numbers in Ferelden, and because of the Battle of Ostagar, only 2 Wardens are left alive, with much of the game having the Warden and the companions he meets along the way, using Grey Warden treaties to gain alliances throughout Ferelden to fight against the Fifth Blight, which include getting involved with the possession of the Jarl's Sun in Redcliffe, which has various different outcomes, which also leads to gaining or destroying the Ashes of Andraste, helping the Dalish Elves against the Wolven Curse, possibly turning against them or creating a lasting peace, siding with the Templars or Mages in the Circle of Magi Tower, getting involved in the succession crisis of Orzammar, which ultimately decides the fate of the ancient Dwarven kingdom. The city of Denerim is on the brink, with Antiv and Crows being assassins who would raise from birth to be killers infesting the city, with mercenaries and criminals running rampant due to Alhao's poor governing of the city, as well as slave rings in the Elven alienage run by mages from the Tevinter Imperium. This is a dark world that takes no prisoners. The culmination of these missions leads to the Landsmeet, which is one of the most politically charged missions I've ever seen in a video game. The amount of choice and variation here is beyond crazy, with everything from executing Loghain, to making Alistair king, to betraying Alistair, and even using political maneuvering to become king yourself as a human noble, or even queen if you're a female human noble. The amount of choice and variation is beyond ridiculous, and if you wanted to see every aspect of dialogue, You would at the very least have to do a minimum of 10 playthroughs to see everything this particular mission has to offer. Regardless of this, whoever ends up in charge supports the Warden's fight against the Fifth Blight, where a Warden from Orlais named Riordan reveals to the Wardens that the only way an Archdemon can be killed forever is if a Grey Warden does the deed, and the essence of the Old God finds the closest living creature with the taint to possess, and because that would be the Warden, both the Old God and Warden would die because the Archdemon can only be reborn if it attaches itself to a Darkspawn, since they don't have souls. But Grey Wardens do, which is why Archdemons die after being killed by Wardens, but this also kills the Warden who deals the final blow. This leads to a very fascinating choice that affects various different aspects of the endings, which is the Dark Ritual, which is basically Morrigan offering the Warden to have a child with her, and the child of the Warden would be born with the taint in their blood, which would lure the essence of the Archdemon to the unborn child instead of the Warden killing it. This is another choice that has so many variations that it can make your head spin. So basically, if you were in a romance with Morrigan and refused to do the ritual, then she will still have a baby after conceiving a child with you earlier in the game, which is the only way the child can be born normally, which changes how Mythal treats Kieran in Inquisition. But the father of said baby could be either the Warden if a male, Alistair or Loghain, and the amount of variation surrounding this in terms of story or relationship is just wild. The final battle ends with the Archdemon being killed and the ending of the Fifth Blight, with the ending revolving around all of the different choices made in game, which as I stated before is quite a lot. My gods, I haven't even touched on the DLC yet, like recruiting the Golem Shale, reclaiming Soldier's Peak, which is a Grey Warden fortress in Ferelden, returning to Ostergard to pay respects to or ignore King Caelan's body, or the post-game DLC like Awakening, which much like Trespasser is one of the best DLCs I've ever played and adds a ridiculous amount of lore and cool characters like Alhao's son, Justice, and even Anders. The Golems of Amgarak DLC, which contains arguably one of the hardest boss fights in the entire franchise, and of course the Witch Hunt DLC, which is the official ending to the Warden and Morrigan story in Origins. And depending on how your relationship was with her during the events of the game, this can play out very differently depending on your choices. There is of course the Liliana Stories DLC, which is a cool little story that leads into the main game. I don't think I could ever do justice to or explain how good of a game Dragon Age Origins is without experiencing it for yourself, and for those who have played it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Dragon Age Origins is hands down not only one of the best Western-made RPGs ever made and what I consider to be the magnum opus of old-school BioWare, but it's also one of the greatest video games of all time. This game, aside from both Witcher 3 and Baldur's Gate 3, is the only game I would consider giving an honest and real 10 out of 10 score. But of course, the game's not perfect by any means, and still does have its issues like several bugs only ever being addressed by the modding community, and also its dated visuals and graphics. Overall, Dragon Age Origins is an experience that can't be missed, and I'm honestly mad at myself for waiting so long to play it, because if I ever was to make a top 5 best games I've ever played video, you can be sure that Dragon Age Origins would make that list, for all of the points I've made in this video, and more that I've yet to say. Now this comes to the end of my ranking, narrative and gameplay review and summaries of all the Dragon Age games in this iconic but now controversial franchise. As said earlier in the video, I do have a full critique and review of Dragon Age The Valgard that you guys should check out if you're interested. And as of the recording of this video, I do have reviews and critiques in the works for the original Dragon Age trilogy that I do hope to release in the coming months. And now I want to hear from you guys. Do you guys agree with my rankings and points I made on the games, or would you have ranked the games differently and completely disagree? Either way, let me know in the comments. And I would also like to say a massive thank you to my channel members, as it's thanks to you fine folks that make these videos possible. And if you guys would like to support my content, then consider becoming a member. And if not, then consider giving the video a like and subscribing if you want to see more content like this. With all that being said, I hope all of my fellow Wardens, Champions and Inquisitors have a wonderful day. Be sure to drink lots of water and get some sleep, and I'll catch you guys in the Fade. Cheers.
Corypheus will never let me live in peace. He made that clear. He intends to be a god, to rule over us all. Corypheus must be stopped.
Wherever you lead us. Have our people been told?
They have. And soon, the world.
Commander, will they follow?
Inquisition, will you follow?